Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LEC Playoffs Round Number 1 overview and analysis video. We are in the best of 3 stage here in the LEC. We are done with the best of 1s. Our first 2 teams have been culled. Team Vitality and Rogue are done for the year. Both of them out of the top 6 in terms of championship points. That means that neither of them can make the season finals. They are done for 2024, but everybody else is still alive. Some paths are a lot easier than others in terms of how the championship points line up, but of course everybody is going to be looking not only to get into that top 6, but also of course to do well here in summer to potentially try and crown themselves as champions, or at least get into that best of 5 stage. So I'm excited to talk about it here today. If you are interested in my thoughts and opinions on everything leading up to this stage here in the LEC, check out the playlist up in the iCard right now. That's every single week of the LEC gone over on this channel. I've talked about every single game so far in the LEC this year, not only here in the summer split. You can check out all of those playlists as well on the channel if you are interested in my thoughts on the year up until this point, but of course the summer playlist is up in the iCard. But of course today we are just going to be going over these 6 series that happened this previous weekend, talking about where I think these teams are landing. By the end of the episode, we're going to know our first teams that have qualified for the best of 5 stage for winners finals already, and of course the teams that are going to be in the lower part of the bracket as well. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover, and at the end of the video, we will be going over the rest of the bracket. Obviously, there's going to be some predictions. We already kind of know what teams are, kind of expected to do well. There's a very clear upper echelon, I would say, in the LEC as opposed to everybody else in the league. But we'll talk about whether or not I think there could theoretically be some upsets moving forward. But today is mostly going to be spent talking about the best of 3s that we got in the first weekend. So let's get right into it. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning of the video. Let's jump into our first best of 3, and it's the number 1 seed that is going to be kicking off our playoff journey. It's SK Gaming taking on the number 6 seed Team Heretics, and predictably SK is going to be able to pick up the 2-0 series win. I think we all expected SK to be pretty big favorites going into this. They have completely turned around their season by bringing in pretty clearly the best bot lane in Europe in Rahel and Luan. They have just completely dominated ever since arriving here at the start of summer. Rahel was my pick for MVP of the regular season, and that is very much carrying through, at least to the start of the playoffs here. SK getting that number 1 seed after kind of being a middling team, not only this year, but basically since they come back into the LEC. It's definitely a big positive sign for them, and obviously this addition is really solidified, but, Rahel has kind of been the standout player, I would say, of these two in the duo. Not so much in this series. This was Luan's time to shine. He's going to get player of the series here for SK. He was unbelievably good on 2 games of Rel here. Honestly, the champion is really strong. I think we're seeing engaged supports be very hit or miss across the world. We're seeing some supports really rise up and be MVP caliber players, and we're seeing some supports really struggle in this meta. I honestly think it's way harder to play support right now than it has been in a little while. Your game plan isn't quite as straightforward. I think laning phase matters a lot, and so if you are the worst player, sometimes you can look like really bad. We saw that with players like Hylissang in the LEC this split, where sometimes even if you are trying to make relatively okay plays, it looks so much worse when you get punished because you're just consistently getting punished. And so when you have a player in Luan who has been super consistent at being able to get those big plays off without really causing any sort of negative ripple effects, not really putting his team in danger in any sort of way, that is massive. And he really has, in my opinion, clearly been the best support in the LEC so far this split. Rahel and Luan were both first team All-Pro for me at the end of the regular season. So not shocking to see him do really well. And then Rahel was also very good. I wanted to see this team maybe punish some mistakes in the early game a bit more, but if they wanted to take it slow, play a little bit more for the 5v5 team fights, I understand that. I think everybody else in this team has also been good. Niski in particular has been awesome over the course of this split. I very much considered him, close to that all-pro standing. He is a top 3-ish mid laner in the LEC at the moment. He's somewhere in that zone, and, Niski will perennially be underrated. You always hear about the games that Niski loses, even though every mid laner in this region loses games for his team super consistently, even the ones that people consider better than Niski, like Humanoid, and, nobody ever talks about the games that Niski wins, and so I'm really on Team Niski. I think this guy is just an asset to basically every team he's ever played for. Irrelevant is very good. I'm somewhere in the middle on Irrelevant at this point. I've pushed back on the Irrelevant is the best top laner in the league kind of hype, but he's obviously still a very big threat. I just think there are a lot of very good top laners in the LEC, and if you do have a question about this team, it's Isma and his consistency, but honestly, he was just straight up better than Yankos in this best of 3, so that's a really good sign. Overall, basically everything you wanted to see from SK was here. I don't think I was super concerned about whether or not this team was going to be able to keep their momentum up, but I know some people have called them regular season merchants in the past. This org kind of has a reputation of crumbling when the games matter more and being a bit more regular season oriented. I had a feeling this team was a bit different. Rahel and Luan are just kind of built a bit different. Niski is always a player who's shown up in the clutch. I wasn't really super concerned that SK was going to fall off, and this was a good confirmation of that, I would say. But for Heretics on the other side, they just have so many problems. This team is just not very good in the grand scheme of things. I think lucky for them, they've done relatively well over the course of this year, or at least relatively consistently over the course of this year. There's a good shot they make it into the top 6, basically regardless of how they finish here, depending on just if any other team creates any sort of major upsets. But this team is just like whatever. I feel so apathetic about this team just in general. There's really nobody on this team that I feel good about. I've been hyping up Flackid for most of this year, and I still think he's the best player on this team right now. Jankos is definitely in that conversation as well. I don't want to take everything away from Jankos, but Flackid I think is definitely been the one to watch in terms of like exciting plays, and he was running it down at points in this series. I think Zviru has very much regressed from what he was in the spring split. I think he's been playing significantly worse, quite frankly. Wunder has just been awful all year. He's going to get done of the series here. I don't even really know what's happening to him. His 1v1 ability in the top lane is just gone. Like, he cannot lane against like actual good top laners like Irrelevant. The ability to just survive on the top side of the map is just not there anymore. It's very strange because he was still very good last year when he was subbed in for Fnatic in their season finals run when Oscar had the wrist injury. He looked awesome in that run. Like, his laning was still great. You felt like you still had, like, maybe not prime Wunder, but, like, what he was for Fnatic for the last, couple of years before he ended up getting benched for Oscar Renin, and then he comes over here to Heretics, and things have just kind of fallen apart for him. He's been one of the weaker top laners in all of the LEC, which is really sad. And then, Trimby has been a major disappointment for this team. I know this team brought him in because they wanted to focus on bot lane a bit more. They wanted Flackid to be a bit more of a primary carry for them, and that has kind of happened for this team. He has definitely been the one to be kind of the resource carry for them. However, I don't think Trimby is really the one contributing to that. His laning has been fine, like it's been average, but that's below his career norms. He's traditionally been the best laning support in the West, let alone the LEC, and so he's just kind of been okay at that so far this split. I think Flackid's team fighting has definitely risen up how the spot lane has performed, but Trimby's not been a particularly good team fighter. There's just not a lot to like about Heretics. They're just such an uninteresting team at the moment in terms of how they play the game. They're that final fight at Dragon, all 5 of them had flash up and they all died. It feels so weird. It feels like this team doesn't really have a great grasp of how they want to play the game, and we're too far into the year for me to be able to give a pass to that, even if I do see some positives mechanically from them. So Heretics, not a team I'm particularly excited about. They're moving down into the lower bracket, but they will likely get into top 6 regardless because of the way championship points work. And then for SK on the other side, this team's really good. Like, they're actually really good. They're clearly one of the top, 3 or 4 teams at worst in the LEC. They could potentially make a run for top 2. I think that that's a realistic thing to potentially try and see out of them. So we'll see what ends up happening, but, they have really exploded, and this is a world's caliber team at the moment. And then moving on to our second series of the first round here, I guess technically the upper bracket first round since nobody starts in lowers. It's Team BDS taking on Mad Lions Koi, and BDS is going to pick up the win here as the second seed. Of course, MBK barely making it into playoffs just at all. They felt like a team that were very clearly going to be bottom 2. Vitality ends up fumbling the bag in the tiebreakers. MDK goes on a really nice run at the end of the final week to get themselves here, and quite frankly, they should be moving on to round number 2 because this was their series to lose, and they said, oh, it's ours to lose, so let's lose it. Like, that's how this ended up going. This was a 3-0 for Mad Lions. I mean, there truly is no reason for BDS to have won a single game in this series. It really was that dominant from MDK early, but their late games, their inability to close out close games, it's really costing them, and this team is just so sloppy. I think that's the big problem, is there is so much talent, and their ability to play out neutral game states is so solid, but their ability to close and end and just be clean in any sort of capacity, it's so horrendous, and it's going to keep them from being one of the better teams in the LEC when they kind of have the potential to be that. I continue to think it's pretty insane for people to look at Mad Lions and say that this roster is a failure, because obviously the fact that we're saying that this roster has potential to have moved on to the top 4, to have crushed BDS in a series like this, it shows how good they could be. They just can't, like, they're so close, they're just not there yet, and it's frustrating. And then for BDS, golly, man, you're walking out of this feeling super lucky that you were winning it. Like, you shouldn't have had 1 game, let alone 2 wins in this series, and so Congrats to the number 2 seed for actually moving on, but I don't know how much of it was actually their gameplay. They are going to have the player of the series for me in Ice. If they don't have Ice in the back half of these games, it becomes a lot more difficult to win. He has really solidified his role over the course of this split. At the beginning part of the year, he was just kind of that consistent AD carry. He was never too high, never too low, never like really all that variable. You kind of knew what you were getting on a game-to-game basis from him. He was good in lane, he was good in team fights, and you could just kind of expect him to do good things, especially when LeBron was playing well in winter. But as we moved into summer, as this meta has transitioned a lot more into 5v5s and scaling, especially here in the LEC, where teams have really adopted and embraced that playstyle, Ice has become the late game team fighter. Like, that is the role that he plays now. He plays Twitch and Aphelios and Jinx, and especially the Jinx, and that's his role. That's what he is going to do. The Zeri has been a big popular pick for him. He is going to play a little bit slow in the early game and then try to take over games in the 5v5s, and that's a very strong role to have in the LEC right now. If you're the best team fighter in the LEC, you can probably win games just based off of that alone, because teams in the mid game are just not good enough to be able to, capitalize on some of the advantages you get from winning early. Right now, that's just kind of the case. Most of the teams in the LEC are way too sloppy to not get to late game. Like, every game is going late, and so having someone like Ice who is super good in that stage is just a really big positive. I think there were other positives. Nuke was actually pretty good in this series. I think the Corki was generally fine, although I think he could have been a bit more aggressive. Labrav, I thought, was actually pretty good. I know the scoreline doesn't look ideal, but I thought he was definitely a little bit better than that scoreline would entail. But there were real problems with BDS. First of all, their early games were awful. Their ability to play out the laning phases were terrible, and you can see that in draft. I mean, they're drafting Corki Aphelios, Corki Jinx, and you're drafting Zyra in the jungle, trying to play into Elyoya's Talia. Like, you're going to be losing pressure in a lot of these matchups, basically, no matter what you do. It's just really frustrating that they didn't really seem to have any sort of answer outside of that. They were lucky in the fact that they were let back in the game, and then also, man, Adam sucked. Like, he's going to get dud of the series on the winning side. I don't even think I have to justify this one. This one was very obvious. I'm a huge fan of Adam. I continue to be like on the Adam hype train in terms of how good he is individually as a player, but this was not a good example of that. He's going to have some stinkers, and this was bad. He almost lost this series for his team. He was useless in all 3 games, and that's pretty frustrating. Sheo also looked a lot worse, I would say, on things like the Zyra than he did on the Talia earlier on, even though that was his 2 wins. So very strange. I don't know. BDS is just such a weird team. They're supposed to be this high floor team, right? Like, that's supposed to be who they are. They're supposed to be this team that you don't have to worry about all that much. They're going to beat the teams that don't have their shit together, and they're probably going to lose to the teams that are more talented than them, but didn't really feel like that in this series. This more so just felt like them getting lucky, and then for MDK, it felt like them just throwing away a free opportunity to move on, and that's got to be even more frustrating. No player of the series, no dud of the series on their side, because honestly, nobody on this team was the worst in this series. They all played well, especially in the laning phases. Frascawi was great in lane. Supa and Alvaro, I thought, had a really great series. Elyoya did a good job early to generate pressure. Mirwin was the better top laner, and so you say all those things, and you're talking about, well, I guess Mad probably won. No, they didn't, and it's so frustrating. There really isn't a lot else for me to talk about. It's just a lack of ability to stay calm and collected in the back half of games, and especially to 5v5, which is the most important thing in the game right now. Mad has struggled with this all year, and especially here in summer, it's really been a bit of a problem for them. If they can just close out games a little bit quicker, they can negate some of the problems they have in the late game. They just need to get more clinical. This team is, basically already locked here for a top 6 spot. I think they are locked, in fact, regardless of what ends up happening now that BDS and SK have won, but Matt is just in such a weird spot. I don't know how to feel about this team because there is so much promise and yet so little actual tangible results outside of the beginning of the year. And for BDS, they're going to feel super lucky to move on to the next round. I'm not feeling that good, really, about this team after this series. I don't feel good about them at all, and that's definitely not a great place to be going into the playoffs. But then moving on now to our third series of round number 1, and it's a former rivalry turned a pretty predictable outcome. It's Fnatic taking on GIANTX, and Fnatic is going to pick up the win. Now, GX did a good job here. They took game number 1. They stayed competitive in this series. They continue to just overperform expectations. I think that's the best way to describe GIANTX right now. They're really not all that talented of a team, but yet they continue to be one of the teams that is the most difficult to take down consistently in the league because they are super scrappy, and honestly, they play the game well. They just don't really have a lot of roster talent, which makes it difficult for them to overcome teams like Fnatic, but, they ended up falling here. Fnatic is the better team, and it's nice to see Fnatic get back on track after what was basically a horrendous final week of the regular season. Basically everything that could have gone wrong for them in that final regular season week did end up going wrong. Humanoid was the worst player in the entire league. You know, they went from undefeated to 4th place. They got the 4th seed going into the playoffs, which was unthinkable going into the week. And so there were just so many things that you didn't want to see from Fnatic in that final week. And it's nice to see that they can kind of turn it back and get a little bit cleaner in a series like this. Player of the series for me is going to go to Oscar Rinnan in the top lane. Never really been the biggest fan of Oscar Rinnan on this channel. I've never really seen the upside. He's just always somebody that I think you're going to have to live with the inconsistencies. Now, that's kind of the same as some of the other top laners that I really like on this channel. Adam is somebody who I praise a lot, and we just saw that he can be very inconsistent, but the difference is that the highs, in my opinion, from Adam are just straight up higher than they are from Oscar Rinnan. There are going to be games that Adam just wins for you in certain matchups, and Oscar doesn't necessarily have that same indicator, but he is really good at a specific subset of champions, and Poppy is definitely one of them. He was very consistent throughout a majority of this series, but really he's getting player of the series for that game number 3, where I thought he was by far the most influential player in the game. I think Broadcast gave player of the series to Razork in the jungle. We will talk about him in a second. I thought he was really good here, definitely out-jungled Juhan in terms of early game pressure, but Oscar I thought was kind of the sneaky important player for Fnatic, and I think generally speaking, he has actually kind of been locked down for them in summer. Even when things were going wrong for them in the final week, it felt like he was good, and he was great in the first couple of weeks when everything was working for Fnatic. He has really probably had his most consistent and probably his best split as a pro here in summer, and I think it's a really good time to have that. Antonio is a good player on the other side of this matchup. He's been one of the more, talented and, high upside pieces for GX over the course of this split, and so it's nice to see Oscar still taking advantage of that matchup. But Razork and Huma were back on track here, at least a little bit. Razork was very good. I personally liked him more on the Sedge than I did on the Brand in this series. Still was very good on the Brand, but I didn't feel like he was the one kind of controlling that game 3. I think people are going to complain about the fact that Fnatic got Brand Corki on blue side in game number 3, which feels illegal. Like, they're 2 of the strongest picks in the game. I will kind of counter with the fact that I don't think Corki has been good in the LEC. I think as a champion, it does fit what LEC teams want to do, because these games, as I said earlier, have been going long. Teams do not know how to close out games in the LEC. They are very sloppy, and so picking something like Corki is just giving you that insurance policy. I think Brand kind of falls into that as well, but neither have really been the game breakers that they've been in other regions. I'm really not all that shocked to see it get through, and I think, Razork and Huma did punish it, but maybe not nearly as hard as some people are going to make it out to be. I thought Huma was just generally fine in this series, certainly wasn't the driving force, and Razork definitely was a bit more noticeable in terms of his pathing. I think especially, at the beginning part of the series, game number 2 in particular, he just completely outplayed Juhan. It was never even remotely close in that matchup, but I think Noah is the other player that I really want to keep looking at. Jun has really solidified himself as one of the best supports in the LEC, basically over the course of like 3 months, which is crazy because he was really bad in winter, and so for him to have been so expertly good in the playoffs in the spring split, and then, carrying that over here to summer, he was awesome at MSI. It's just really good to see the bot lane kind of clicking. Noah, I think, has found a role on this team. The meta, I think, suits him a bit better now than it did earlier on in the year, and it allows him to play a little bit more free. I think generally him being more aggressive just helps the team out a ton, but Oscar was the player that I really noticed the most in this series, and that really is a positive to him overall. But for GX on the other side, again, it's really hard to be critical of this team because they really shouldn't be here. This is not a top 8 roster on paper, and they really haven't performed in a way that's been like, oh, they have to be a top 8 team, right? They're just a team that continuously overperforms expectations in the sense that they capitalize on the mistakes that other teams are making. They don't make nearly as many egregious errors as other teams, even in the playoffs right now, like Mad Lions and Heretics, that are going to have these weird moments where they're just not able to like actually generate the same kind of leads they should. GX is really good at execution. They just don't really have a great baseline to work with, and it makes it really tough to beat a team like Fnatic, who is incredibly talented. Juhan is going to get done of the series for me. The Amumu's just not it, man. Like, the priority on that champion, I just don't really understand. I get the idea behind, like, perma lockdown, and you want to go for things like the Vi in game number 3 as well, but Amumu is just not a good champion right now. His tank stats are really low. He is not survivable. Like, he is just not in a position where he can be played super frequently at a high level, even if the kit is strong. And on top of that, I certainly don't think you can play him with things like Lucian Ezreal as your mid-jungle or your mid-bot duo, and Azir Ezreal. Like, I don't really understand what the idea behind the Amumu pick here is. I don't think it ended up working out, and Juhan is going to get done of the series for it. He was really slow. Like, I know that's always been a bit of a problem for him. He's really not somebody who can play fast. He's not a skirmisher. He doesn't want to fight. He wants to set up his teammates, and he wants to play for 5v5s, but it really hurt the team here. And I'm also going to be at least a little bit critical of Antonio. I actually think he was generally fine. There were some weird interactions with Ornn Born in this series, but Oscar was definitely better in game number 3 in particular on the other side of this matchup, and that's really not ideal. Big credit to Jackie's, though. This guy just continues to pull out wins. That Tristana game in game 1 was fantastic, and it was banned out the rest of the series. You felt pretty confident that Jackie's could actually carry this series in certain circumstances if he was given the opportunity to. Credit to Fnatic, obviously, for not letting that happen, but Jackie's is the real deal. He has completely ascended here. In summer, it reminds me so much of VTO's first, like, major breakout split on Misfits in terms of him being, like, the carry on that team. So I'm going to continue to monitor him. Hopefully he can keep growing as a player, because I don't think anything's really going to happen this year. And then Patrick and Ignar are literally whatever. Like, they are such whatever in the bot lane. They're average. In terms of bot lane, they're not the best, they're not the worst. It is what it is. But GX is such an interesting team. They're actually pretty fun to watch, and they're really easy to root for and cheer for, but they just don't really have the skill to be able to overcome a team like Fnatic, who is one of the best teams in the LEC, despite what happened in the final week of the season, in week number 4, where things just kind of were a disaster. So I believe in Fnatic. I believe this team is going to do rather well, and obviously with this win, we'll talk about them more later in the video. And then moving on to our 4th and final best of 3 here, at least in round number 1, before we get into our round 2 matchups for the end of the video. We have G2 Esports taking on Corp, and G2 is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. Number 3 seed versus number 5 seed. Corp obviously happy to be here. This is their first best of 3 of the entire year. They've yet to be able to make this stage, so I think they're going to be very happy in the fact that they ended up making it here in the first place. Unfortunately, they drew the best team in the LEC in round number 1, and that makes it a bit more difficult for them to pull off the upset, but honestly, they played pretty well in this series, and to me, they are clearly the number 5 team. I say clearly, if only because 6, 7, and 8 are just not teams that I would expect to be able to make interesting runs unless, like, Mad Lions clean something up, or Heretics figures it out, or GIANTX just continues to overperform. Like, Corp feels a step above them, but yet they feel kind of a step down from everybody in the top 4, which I think is unfortunate, and it certainly makes it a lot more difficult with the fact that they need a ton of championship points to get into the season finals at all, but this was a good performance from them. I really don't think they can walk away from this feeling too negative. G2's going to feel pretty good. Obviously, not dropping a game is pretty ideal for them. Player of the series is going to go to Yike in the jungle. He was by far clearly the most important player in this series for them. The Brand, the Zyra both looked very good for them. And honestly, those champions looked really good in the playoffs. It's funny because I don't think they looked as strong in the LEC as they did in other regions. There are other regions that have just been dominating on these champions. You know, Brand and Zyra have really taken over the pro meta, but the LEC really is yet to kind of catch on to that a little bit more than a lot of the other regions. They're still more on the Sejuani train than a lot of other people are. I'm on the Sejuani train. I think Sej is still an incredibly solid pick. I'll talk about maybe why I don't think it was great for Corp in this series because of just the players that you have at your disposal, but for Yike being able to get those AP carries and to be able to dominate on them, that's what you want to see. This is a meta where someone like Yike, who was known for his carry junglers before he came up to G2, like this is a meta where he should be able to take over. This is really what I expected to see from him, and he looked good. Rest of the team was also great. Broken Blade just continues to look awesome. He has honestly had a great ending of the year. I think Summer Split has really been his best and his most consistent of the year up until this point, and that's not to say that he was bad in the other ones, just that there were more concerns in terms of games where it's like, that feels like old Broken Blade. There were moments that felt like Schalke Broken Blade or TSM Broken Blade, and you didn't want to see those. That's not the version of Broken Blade you want to see on G2. You want to see what you got in 2022, 2023. That version of Broken Blade is great for a team like this, and so you were hoping to get that back, and I think Summer has really proved that that is still there. Kana was not nearly as good in the top lane on the other side of this matchup, which we will talk about a bit later. Caps, Hans, Mickey all did their job. Mickey in particular I thought looked really good on Leona. He's also stabilized a lot. God, he was horrible for most of this year. Like, I can't stress enough just how awful Mickey X was, and he will never get the blame that he sometimes deserves. Like, he was Hylissang levels of bad for like a majority of the winter and spring split. No one's really going to talk about that because G2 was able to win without him essentially playing like a human being, but it's nice to see that he's locking in when it actually does matter a bit more towards the end of the year. But, you know, if Caps is the player that I'm talking about the least, if he's the one who was getting in the most trouble and targeted the most, and they were still able to kind of dominate both of these games, and maybe not dominate, but at least walk away feeling pretty good about both of these games, that's a pretty good place to be. So G2 with a nice win. And then for Corp, you went up against the toughest team in the LEC, the back-to-back-to-back champions, and you looked okay. Like, yeah, you weren't able to take a game, but it was pretty solid here in a best of 3. Vladi in particular particular, he's awesome, man. Like, I'm really happy to see what he has been able to do. I talked about this, and the NLC is really one of the only ERLs that I get to watch on like a regular basis being in America, like just time zone wise. Like, it's really one of the only leagues that's on in the daytime that I actually get to watch when I'm awake. And Vladi was awesome. He was a player that I was really interested in seeing. He had his flaws, and I was definitely a bit concerned, but I was interested, you know, in seeing what he was going to be able to do at the LEC level, and he has exceeded like my expectations by a billion points. Like, he has truly been great for this team. He's been the best player on K-Corp, and it's not been particularly close, in my opinion. He was like that again. The Yone was really good, and Caps, honestly, was not as good as Vladi in these two games, or at least not as, like, stylish. I think Caps wasn't bad, but Vladi was really good, and I'm really excited to say that. Hopefully, he's someone they can build around, especially with their Superstar AD carry coming up next year. But Closer was also pretty interesting. The only concern I have is I just don't think Sejuani is one of the picks that I want to see Closer on in, like, a make-or-break best-of-3. Closer's an aggressive player. Put him on these things that can dive. Put him on Jarvan. Put him on Vi, like, if that's what you want to do. Like, those are the champions that I feel a little bit more comfortable with his playstyle on. The Sedge, I think, still works for him, and clearly it worked for Vladi. The Sedge-Yone combo is very difficult to deal with, but I just don't know if that's what I would do to get the most out of my players in terms of draft, even if I do think from a premises it kind of works, right? Like, I understand what they were looking for. I just don't think it necessarily fits what these guys in particular are best at. But my dud of the series is unfortunately going to go to Kana in the top lane. Broken Blade just kind of abused him in the 1v1 matchup. I don't think he was that bad in game 1, but the Gnar was truly useless in game 2. Just didn't do anything. And I think the problem is that Kana was hyped up as somebody who was going to be a difference maker. In the top lane, he's kind of just been a guy. And even at times, he's been worse than that. I think that's really not ideal for K-Corp. When you're talking about the best player on this team being Vladi, the one that they promoted from the ERLs in the middle of the season, it's really not an ideal place to be sitting. I think you wanted a better performance out of top lane. I think bot lane was fine. Upset and Targamas didn't really do anything. Their KDAs look a bit better than maybe their performances would indicate, but they weren't awful. Like, Targamas was fine, and I think that's something you can breathe a sigh of relief on, but you know, K-Corp is fine. Like, there's really no other way to put them. They are clearly number 5 in the LEC right now, in being worse than the top 4 and being better than the bottom 4. I think it's just, you know, very clear to me. So, you know, we'll see what happens with them. They move down into the lower bracket now. They need a miracle, I should say, to qualify for season finals, and they'll get their chance in a big matchup against MDK, a major rivalry, best-of-3 matchup where one of their seasons, or one of at least their splits, will be over with MDK having already qualified for season finals. It's going to be interesting. I'm really excited to see where that ends up going, and I'm sure K-Corp's going to be fired up for it. But G2, they look great. We're going to talk about them a bit more in just a few minutes because we're talking about the round number 2, the winners bracket round number 2, but they're the best team in the LEC, at least until proven otherwise. But now that we've gotten through round number 1, it's time to get into our winners round number 2. We got that last weekend as well, so our final 2 series will be seeing who is going to make winners finals out of the 4 teams that won in round 1. And we're kicking that off with a number 1 versus number 4 seed matchup, SK Gaming taking on Fnatic. And Fnatic is going to win it, and not just win it, they are going to destroy SK Gaming. And this was definitely a bit of a shocking outcome for me. Not because Fnatic won. I think I anticipated Fnatic winning. That's why they've been higher in the power rankings. They've stayed higher in the power rankings. They've been at number 2. SK's been at number 3, basically the entire split, even with everything that's gone on. You know, Fnatic should be the better of these 2 teams, but with how dominant it was, I really was surprised by that. That certainly was not something I was anticipating in terms of the outcome of these 2 games. I want to give a lot of credit to Fnatic. They clearly have cleaned up whatever issues they were having at the end of the year. My biggest concern for Fnatic is the fact that they are very streaky individually as players, and definitely collectively as a team. This unit has already proven how streaky they can be, not only this year, but they were streaky last year as well. Typically, that's being really bad in the regular season, or at least underperforming a lot in the regular season and figuring things out in the playoffs and when the games matter more. But they were really good in the regular season, and then they started not being good right before playoffs started, and so I got worried. Like, I'll be honest, I got concerned that that stretch was going to carry over because of just how this team operates. But lucky for them, they figured out whatever the problem was, and they bounced back this weekend to just be amazing. This was a phenomenal, like, top tier LEC performance. Player of the series for me is going to go to Humanoid. I think you could realistically give this to basically anybody on the team. Everybody played super well in this series, but I thought Humanoid was the most dominant. Like, we'll talk about the mid lane matchup, I guess now. I mean, mid gap was ginormous in this series. I'm a Niski defender. I think his resume speaks for itself. This guy is pretty consistently near the top of the standings, basically no matter what team he has been on, no matter what region he has been in. He is somebody who has consistently been able to win, regardless of whether or not you think that that is, like, his reasoning or not. But Humanoid embarrassed him in this series, and that was very clear. Niski played horrible and Humanoid played excellent, and this is kind of a role reversal from what we were seeing at the end of the regular season. Humanoid was playing terrible, Niski was playing really well. It's cool to see Humanoid kind of do the Humanoid thing. One of the things I've been the most critical of Humanoid for is the fact that for like 75% of the year, he just doesn't try. Like, he's bad as a mid laner, and it's really hard to evaluate him because he's not good until his back's up against the wall, and then all of a sudden he becomes the best mid laner in the LEC, and it's very difficult to kind of get an idea of where he lands in that regard. He's been way better this year, as I've talked about on this channel. He's been super consistent, one of the best players in the LEC, but things were starting to get a bit more concerning, and this is not one of those series that you have to win if you're a Fnatic, and so, you know, I was kind of waiting and seeing to see if Humanoid would kind of show up in that kind of way, and he did. Trust me, he dominated Niski. An amazing performance for him. Noah goes deathless in this series. I think he gets the broadcasts player of the series. He deserves it as well. I mean, the dude was nearly perfect in terms of his positioning, and he did that against the best bot lane in the LEC, or at least the bot lane that has performed the best in the LEC so far this split. Jun was unbelievably good on the Alistair and the Rakan. I very much considered him for player of the series. Oscar continues to look excellent. He had a great week. Razork looked really good. I think generally Fnatic just looked amazing across the board. This was a domination. They looked incredible, and they're moving on to winners finals. This guarantees them top 3. Obviously, they had already qualified for the season finals. It would have taken an absolute miracle for them not to have gotten in. In fact, I don't even know if it was possible with how things shaped out in the regular season, but they've definitely guaranteed it at this point, and this is likely going to be a team that makes a run for another finals, and who knows, if everything goes right, like, they could compete for an LEC trophy here in summer, and they definitely should be going to Worlds. But for SK on the other side, this is a team we've been hyping up, and we've been talking about them as a team that can compete with Fnatic and G2 if everything were to go right. That's not the version of them we got today. We got the SK chokers in the playoffs that we've become a bit more accustomed to from this organization. I thought things might be a bit different because this bot lane felt a lot more legit than a lot of the other rosters that quote-unquote overperformed, you know, when SK was the number 3 seed or whatever in winter, and that just wasn't real, right? The roster wasn't good enough to justify that. I didn't feel that way about this roster. This should have been a team that lived up to that expectation, and it didn't. Everybody collapsed. Like, Niski is definitely the most noticeable, and he played the worst. He is easy choice for dud of the series. I'm not going to defend how Niski played in this series. You know, I'll defend the general concept of Niski, because I think every player is more than they are in one best of 3. He's a multiple-time champion, multiple-time MVP. Like, obviously, he is a good player, but this was awful. Like, Humanoid embarrassed him, but it wasn't just Niski. I don't want the narrative to turn into Niski lost this series for SK. Everybody got blasted. Isma picked Nidalee in game 2 and did nothing, like, was super passive into Razork Sejuani. Like, what are you expecting to happen in that matchup? Irrelevant got completely outplayed by Oscar Rinnan, even if he was probably the most interesting player on SK in this series. And Rahel and Luan, I mean, 2 people that have basically yet to be, like, beaten. Like, they've lost games, but they've really not been beaten 2v2 across this split so far. Like, they got embarrassed by Noah and June, who were infinitely better than them in this all-Korean bot lane matchup. It was really interesting to kind of take note of this, and the only thing I'm concerned about for SK, it's not the fact that I don't think this team is good enough. I'm worried that this org lacks the finishing touches, right? Do they have the confidence to be able to bounce back from a loss like this? If they can get their shit together, if they just say, all right, well, we lost to Fnatic, but we're going to get another shot at them or G2 or somebody further along in the playoffs, and we just have to be more ready for that, then I think this team is talented enough to be able to make that work, but they have to keep their heads on straight, and they can't let this loss define them. Like, you can't get down from this loss. You have to put it behind you, so I guess we'll see how they respond to it, but Fnatic looked unbelievable here. Truly, like, one of the best teams in the West, and we've been waiting for Fnatic to look like that for what feels like forever. It feels like it's been, you know, a long time coming for Fnatic to genuinely feel like a team that can compete for an LEC title again, and hopefully this is the version of them that can do it. And that's going to bring us to our second of the round 2 series and our final series of the weekend, and it's Team BDS taking on G2 Esports. And G2 is going to pick up the 2-0 here as well. We know our winners finals now. We will talk about that a bit at the end of this section, and of course once we get into the bracket analysis, but G2 looks incredible here. This is not an upset of any sort. G2 has utterly dominated BDS over the course of this year. This matchup in particular has just never really gone BDS's way. Let's ignore the regular season matchup here in summer. G2 doing what they do best and just kind of beating BDS very clearly. They looked great in this series, and specifically the same matchup that has always haunted BDS, at least in terms of this iteration, continues to haunt BDS because Caps continues to obliterate them. He is going to get player of the series. You know, I'm not going to go super hard in this segment, but I don't know. I feel bad for Nuke. Like, there is something that Caps knows about Nuke in terms of playstyle, in terms of just like the way he wants to operate in the laning phase that just lets Caps absolutely obliterate him every single time these two play against each other. It has never gone Nuke's way. There has never been a time where Nuke has really ever been able to survive against Caps. I don't know what it is, because Caps obviously beats everybody. Like, this isn't something that is entirely unique to Nuke, but Nuke's worst games are always against BDS, or against G2. He's on BDS. What am I talking about? His worst games are always against G2, and you just have to wonder why that is. Obviously, I'm sure there is some sort of explanation that makes at least a little bit of sense, but I don't know what it is. We'll talk about it when we get into the BDS section, but man, Caps just obliterates this team every time. You can't give him Tristana. Caps' Tristana has to be permabanned in this meta. It is just not allowed. It can't be allowed. Game number 2 was the best example for why he is the best player Europe has ever seen by, in my opinion, a pretty ginormous margin. There has been nobody in this region's history that has been able to do what Caps has been able to do for as long as he's been able to do it, the success that he has had. He is Europe's greatest player ever, and he continues to prove that every single game. The rest of this team also did well. I want to give a big shout out to the bot lane, Hans and Mickey, who continue to look really good here. Again, I talked about it earlier, but Mickey locking in makes this team even more dangerous than they were at the beginning of the year, and they've already won 2 titles. They did that with Mickey X playing some pretty horrible League of Legends, and so if Mickey is just going to be good from now on, if he has figured something out, if MSI and Poppy support has really, like, you know, fixed him in terms of his mentality, if he's willing to pull out, you know, freaking Seraphine in game number 2 and still do well on it, then yeah, this team's going to be a bit of a problem to try and run into. So that's going to be something to continue to monitor because Ice and Labrov have been good on the other side of this matchup. But Broken Blade Yike also pretty solid. Broken Blade didn't really get to do a whole ton. He had to play against Mundo and Malphite in this series, and so he was a little bit shut down in terms of the aggressive place, but still not too bad, all things considered. Just a great win for G2. They continue to truck along, and they move on to winners finals. Not really a shock there, but for BDS, this is also not a surprise, especially after how the first round went. They barely got past Mad Lions, and honestly, they probably shouldn't have gotten past Mad Lions, and so I don't think anybody gave them a real shot against G2 in terms of what their form was like, but like I said, Nuke is going to get dead of the series. There is just some voodoo curse on Nuke that means that he is just going to struggle against G2. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to stop it. But what I do know is that it's just, it sucks. It sucks for Nuke. He's going to get dead of the series, like I said. Not very good. The Corki was really bad, in particular in game number 2, but he didn't do anything in game number 1 on the Taliyah either. Just not a very good series for the BDS mid laner, and he has always struggled against G2. I think Sheo is also really bad here. I'm much lower on Sheo individually as a player. I've seen people talking about him as if he's like one of the best players on BDS. I have very much gone on record saying he has, in my opinion, clearly been the least impactful player on BDS over the course of this year. I just don't think that his tape is all that good. I think the Viego is obviously the game you're looking at and saying like, well, it didn't work. Like, it didn't work out, but the Zyra wasn't better. Like, game 2 also, he got destroyed going into Maokai as Zyra, which is never ideal. Adam, you know, people are going to criticize the build in game 2 on the Malphite. I understand the idea behind it, but it certainly did not work. Ice and Labrov were probably the most important part of this team for BDS, at least trying to get them some resources. In that second game, Ice in particular continues to be a really good front-to-back fighter, but G2's better, and that really is just kind of it at the end of the day. That's the whole story. For BDS, that means they're pushed down now into the lower bracket. I think they'll be fine, but we'll have to see. This team has really struggled as the season and the split in general has gone further along, not only here in summer, but that's happened every single split so far. They've really struggled to maintain their momentum. They've been able to make the best of 5 stage, and they've yet to be able to win a best of 5. Hopefully, you know, they can at least make the best of 5 stage again here, even if they're not able to get much further than that. And for G2, they've made the best of 5 stage. They're in winners finals. They have a chance to go back to back to back to back. 4-peat here is on the table for G2 if you include last year, and so it's definitely going to be interesting, but, you know, again, I said this earlier, I will say it again until proven otherwise. They are the team to beat here in the LEC. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC Summer Playoffs Round Number 1 overview and analysis video. Do hope you guys enjoyed. Again, we know our top 2 teams in the winners finals here, Fnatic taking on G2, where you're going to see who ends up making it to Grand Finals. Of course, that means they have both made the best of 5 stage, and they have locked themselves in for a spot in the season finals. Joining them is, of course, BDS, who has enough championship points to guarantee they get there even if they don't win another series, and maybe surprisingly, Mad Lions is also joining them. They have enough championship points to guarantee that even if they lose their series to Corp, they will be in season finals. That being said, some interesting matchups in the upcoming week. We have Team Heretics and GX down in the lower bracket round number 1. That's definitely going to be intriguing. In my opinion, it is the team with more upside in Team Heretics that's yet to be able to find any consistency versus probably the most consistent team on the lower part of the bracket that just doesn't have the upside in GIANTX. So pretty interesting, clash of styles there, if you will. And then Mad Lions, of course, taking on Corp, the matchup we all really want to see. We've wanted to see these teams play a high-pressure best-of-3 all year long. The rivalry is, expansive, and this will be talked about for the rest of the year. And especially with Mad Lions having already locked in season finals, if they can end Corp's season as well, that's going to be a major talking point. So definitely something to consider. Just as an update for the other 2 teams, the 5 and 6 teams that can make the season finals, it's almost certainly going to be SK and Team Heretics. They are the 2 that have a ginormous lead. GX and Corp technically have a chance because they're still alive, but I think both of them would need to make top 2 in order to do that. I know Corp has 0 championship points going into this split, and so I think they would have to make finals in order to make the season finals in general, and I think GIANTX is in at least a relatively similar spot. They might only have to make top 4, but still a pretty out there thing for them to have to be able to do, something that is probably not likely for a team like GIANTX, and so it's looking like it will be SK and Heretics, but let me know what you think is going to happen down in the comment section below. Who do you think will be joining Fnatic and G2 in the best of 5 stage, and who do you think will be joining the 4 teams that have already qualified for the season finals by the end of the year? Do you think it will be chalk with SK and Heretics, or do you think that GX or Corp can go on the kind of run needed in order to get them in? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like on the video. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you are new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be covering every single series here in the LEC up until the finals here at the end of summer, and then, of course, the season finals as well before Worlds, and of course we also cover all of the other major regions. That's the LCS, the LCK, and the LPL every single week on this channel, and we also cover Tier 2 over in North America, the NACL, so this is a comprehensive overview channel of everything going on in LoL Esports. If you're excited or interested in that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.